On October 25th, 1956, 800 to 1,000 Hungarians were massacred outside of the parliament building, and the Hungarian government covered it up for like 30 years. So I'm continuing where I left off from my last video. This is the third now in my short introduction to the Hungarian Revolution. I'm writing a book about it. This is gonna be like mostly from what I've written. And if you didn't know where I stand with Palestine. I got this from a small business called Palestinian Elegance. They're located in Richardson, Texas. You can find their shop on TikTok where I got this, or you can go to their store, or you can go to their website and buy it from there. They're a nice family. They're Palestinian small business here in America. So between October 24th and 25th, 14,000 more Russian troops arrived in Hungary, and it was primarily in Budapest, but they also occupied several other cities, and they went to protect the border from Western alliances that might try to intervene and help Hungarians, but they didn't. So by that time, the second day of the revolution, there were 34,000 Russian troops and 1,350 tanks occupying Hungary. They were fighting against several thousand. The estimates go up to like 26,000, but that's from like first person, narratives. They were there. That's how many they think were. But if you like go to Wikipedia, I think the page says like, it was only a few thousand Hungarian freedom fighters, but it was more than a few thousand total. But 34,000 troops with 1,300 tanks were fighting against several thousand university students, high school students, and working class peasants. There was a standoff between the Russians inside of their tanks and a group of nervous young protesters on the ground. A few of the students climbed up onto the tanks with a sign that they had like a flyer that they'd printed out to give to the Russians that said, "Russian friends, do not shoot. They have tricked you. You are not fighting against counter-revolutionaries. We Hungarians want an independent, democratic Hungary. You are not shooting at fascists, but at workers, peasants, and university students." The fascist thing I'll touch on later because that's a really popular thing to call revolutionaries is, oh, they're the fascists. And then, it's usually not. So the Russians on the tanks were friendly, and they agreed that the fighting was kind of pointless, and they thought the government was lying to them about what was happening in general. So they welcomed all of these students that were in the streets to climb aboard the tanks, and I think it was a row of 5 tanks, and they offered them a ride to the parliament, like the center of what was happening at the moment. It was a big protest, and they said, "You want a ride?" It was like a police escort. The one in the front had a Hungarian flag that the students held up. And the pictures from that scene, people don't know the backstory of. Now, the Hungarians did acquire Russian tanks, and there are pictures of Hungarians on tanks, but the scene there was friendly. It was awe-inspiring. So the protest was at the Parliament building outside of it. The Parliament is huge. It is gorgeous as well. And it's right in the center of where everything's happening. The Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Agriculture, this, that, and the other. And the protest was actually considered illegal at that moment because they were under martial law for the last 2 days. So the police, the secret police, the Soviets, the Hungarian military kind of just let the protest happen, even though it was supposed to be banned, but they had a plan for it. So the protesters were peaceful. They were unarmed. It was mostly students and high school students and university students and just regular people. They were protesting and demanding one man named Erno Gero to leave. They hated him. He was a communist. He spent 2 decades in the USSR after the Hungarian Revolution of 1919. So Hungary had three revolutions within 108 years or so, less than 110 years, 3 revolutions. And Erno Gero spent 2 decades in the USSR where he became a KGB agent. And then he returned to Hungary. He was a communist after World War II, and he was the most powerful man in Hungary for a brief period where he acted as the first secretary of the Hungarian Workers' Party, which was the Communist Party, the Workers' Party. And the first secretary is like the top dog of the Communist Party. Anyways, he was ousted by the Russians on the second day of the revolution because people hated him and the Hungarians were protesting like for him to leave. So the Russians were like, fine, we'll give you like one of your concessions, right? Whenever the Hungarians would demand for somebody in the government to leave or like step down for them from their position, the Soviets would say, that's a direct threat. That's an incitement to violence. That is a call for terrorism. Does it sound familiar at all? And this Bloody Thursday, this was 2 days into the revolution, and the survivors of that day said that the mood of the protest before the violence was light and hopeful, because up until then they thought that the revolution was like going in their favor. They had the upper hand for just a little bit. It's referred to as Bloody Thursday because it was the first, and perhaps since then there has not been one that has outdone it, right? It was the largest public massacre in Europe after World War II. Published estimates of the number of people killed range from 20 to 1,000. So the freedom fighters became revolutionaries overnight, like just looking at the massacre, and they thought, we're going on the offense now. They acquired new locations for their bases, like small streets and squares that they could defend easily, and they developed brand new tactics, like overnight, to fight the Soviets. There were more than 1,500 civilian freedom fighters at that moment on the 25th, and Malater was in charge of about 500 Hungarian conscripts, like soldiers, at the Killian barracks, which was across the street from the Corvin Cinema, which is where the Corvin group stronghold was. It was a cinema and a passageway, and then like an alleyway that the tanks couldn't get through, basically. And then the cinema, which connected to underground passageways that they could go like not all over the city, but a pretty good radius, and pop out and attack Soviets and then go back in. And it was right across the street from a military barracks, so it was prime location. Anyways, the Corvin Cinema put a banner outside of the theater, and they said on the banner, there are 3 great powers, the US, the USSR, and the Corvin Group. They were very, very proud of themselves. At first, the Corvin Group and Malater's Hungarian soldier men, they argued about who would make the decisions about the operations, but when the news of the massacre, Bloody Thursday, reached them, they put aside their differences so that they could fuck up some Soviets, right? Within hours, on October 25th, the freedom fighters were able to take down 3 Russian tanks and capture 2 tanks and an armored vehicle. Like, they destroyed 3 tanks and then they took 2 more and an armored vehicle through a series of attacks using the underground passageways underneath the theater. And soon the Soviet tanks moved on to, they moved to the cinema and the passageways for their first large battle, the Soviets and then the freedom fighters. And the Soviets retreated from that battle in defeat. And this greatly boosted the morale of the freedom fighters. And when the Soviets left, they left behind armor and equipment. And that loss was the first moment where freedom fighters thought, this is possible. Even if it was a remote possibility, the longer they could hold out, the longer they could continue fighting the Soviets, maybe the world will wake up. Maybe the world will send in help. They wanted help from the Western powers, but we did nothing. Today, outside of the Ministry of Agriculture building in Budapest, there is a small memorial, little placard thing, and then there are silver bullet holes in the wall rather than the actual bullet holes that were there. They replaced the wall, and it's an overlooked memorial because it's hard to miss, but still, the official record is that a minimum of 20 people died. The people who were there know what they saw. People went missing, and then the government was just like, I don't know. Don't know where they went. And when you think about this compared to like other atrocities, other things that the Soviets did, or even like what the Nazis did, information is so easily hidden by governments when they don't want you to know, right? The Soviets tortured hundreds of thousands of people all over the USSR and the Eastern Bloc. They killed millions of people. And the gulags, the concentration camps, the labor camps, millions of people went to them and then like literally was never heard of. And it's just the amount of information that people are willing to hide. It's wild. But I said I would touch on the fascism thing. So fascism and communism are theoretically two opposing sides of the political spectrum, far right and far left. However, fascism and communism share so many things. They look pretty identical, right? If you actually look at how the Soviet Union operated and how, say, the Nazis and fascist Italy operated, it's very similar. But communists hate fascists and fascists hate communists. Do you know how many times I've been called a commie bitch on like TikTok? Because I used to talk about World War II. That's my thing. So I started my TikTok about the war, and people would like comment that I'm a commie bitch or whatever because I don't like fascism, right? But then I get comments from tankies, which are Soviet loving people, and they call me like a fascist. It's a very common tactic to just be like, oh, you don't agree with me, or you don't like that I'm like murdering all of your civilians and sending people to gulags. You're a fascist. Obviously, there is no in between. There's nothing else. It is just one or the other. And the communists called the revolutionaries fascists in order to discredit the revolution, right? And it's very common. Another thing that they called the revolution was anti-Semitic. And I'll get more into it later because anti-Semitism runs deep everywhere, obviously. But it's also a scapegoat to just be like, you're anti-Semitic, therefore nothing you do or say like is valid. So the Hungarian revolutionaries were killing off the secret police, the AVH. And some people in the secret police were Jewish. And some of the things that the people who murdered in cold blood the secret police, they were ruthless. Like, it really, really hurt the reputation of the revolutionaries. And so many people acknowledged that. And several of the leaders of the different groups of the freedom fighters forbade their soldiers from killing the AVH because it made them look bad. Like, it truly did. And because some of the AVH was Jewish, and because some of the revolutionaries killed the AVH who like accepted bribes and they took money and they hoarded money, when they killed them, they put money in their mouth or they left them in a pile of money. It was blood money, so they weren't going to take it. But because of anti-Semitic tropes, like, you know, they're money greedy or whatever, that helped fuel the Soviets. Like, they're just anti-Semitic. And people say that to me all the time. Like, when I first started talking about this on TikTok, they were like, those were just anti-Semitic insurrectionists. They weren't. And the Soviet Union being like, oh, they're anti-Semitic fascists is so ironic because the Soviets were so fucking anti-Semitic. Oh my God, did they hate Jewish people? But so many of them were Jewish, and a lot of them were Jewish but also pretended not to be, and then they attacked other Jewish people, or like, you know, sent people on witch hunts to find other Jewish people. They were what you would call a self-hating Jew, right? But I'll talk about that later. Anyhows, I will pick up with October 26th and 7th, day 4 and 5 of the revolution. It goes all the way up to 12 days. So this is going to be actually a pretty long series. Remember to like and subscribe if you're still listening. Thank you very much. Survivors of the massacre said that the firing came from multiple directions. So the AVH, the secret police, fired machine guns from the roof of the Ministry of Agriculture into the crowd of unarmed civilians. The Russian tanks that were stationed all over the streets, and they kind of barricaded the protesters in, also fired at them from the ground, and they kind of moved in and surrounded the crowd and pushed them up against the doors of the Ministry of Agriculture. They tried to get in, like the survivors, the people who were there, tried to get into the building to prevent themselves from being shot on the streets, right? And inside of the building, the secret police were also lying in wait and started shooting out from the doors, like from the windows and everything, of the Ministry of Agriculture. The shooting was coming from tanks, sharpshooters on the roof, and inside of the building that was the closest to them for them to escape. When the massacre was over, the Soviets took the bodies away. People remember seeing them plow bodies, like with a bulldozer, to move them into the cemetery where they dug a mass grave, and they put their bodies in there. They took the identity papers away so that dead bodies couldn't be accounted for later. And some of the bodies might have been cremated in a crematorium that was not in use at the moment, but bodies were piled up out back, like of the crematorium. People remember seeing that. The eyewitnesses who were there that day told of seeing the bodies stacked up against the walls of the building and in the cemetery. And the estimates are consistent with the eyewitnesses saying that it was at least 800 people who were dead. Out of a crowd of 5,000, you would realize if like a fifth of the people fell and were killed. But, of course, the Soviets did their best to hide information and lie to the public, especially about the amount of people that they killed on any given day or massacre, and the people they arrested and the people they deported. The Hungarian government didn't talk about the massacre. They just forgot to mention it for 30 years. They pretended it didn't happen as they walked by the bullet holes on the walls of the Ministry of Agriculture, and they just pretended, no, didn't happen. A singular report during the revolution by a man named Laszlo Toth. He was the chief of staff of the army. He declared, quote, "The Soviet troops received the order to liquidate the protest in front of the parliament. This they did. Soviet soldiers opened fire on the rebels." Not revolutionaries, not freedom fighters, not students, not kids. Rebels, right? Most of the communications to the Kremlin at that time were public, most of them. But that report from Laszlo Toth remained a secret for decades. The Soviet troops most likely received their orders to liquidate the square from Ivan Surov. He was the head of the KGB, the mother to the AVH, the secret police. He wasn't far away from the massacre at the time. He was just down the street at the Communist Party headquarters. They were having a meeting. He was already irritated about the reports of the Russian tanks that gave the students a ride to the protest because he called it like fraternizing. You know, he was like, oh, we don't fraternize with the enemy, right? So a report about the demonstration at the parliament was sent over to him, like a little messenger boy came, and he was like, there's a big protest happening at this moment. What do you want to do about it? And that news just sent Ivan Surov over the edge, and he ordered the Soviets to clear the square. But see, it was probably already planned to, have this massacre, because why would there be sharpshooters on the roof if you weren't planning something, right? Why would the Soviet tanks blockade everybody in if you weren't already planning to kill everybody there? So the order to clear the square, it was already in the works, right? That was just like the moment that he was like, you know what, fuck it, this is the time. So the news of the massacre spread to the public, like from people who were there. And it changed the entire mood of the freedom fighters from excited to bitter and angry. And that's when they started acting out of revenge. The protesters who survived the massacre became militias overnight. The fire, so to speak, was lit under them, and they went into armed rebel groups. Witnesses say that the protesters who were there immediately left got some guns, and then began fighting the Soviets. Like, it was immediate. They decided, I am going to kill you all now. Like, I mean, not really. They didn't actually kill a bunch of... several thousand Soviets died, but I digress. I'm getting off topic. Anyways, a few hundred of the protesters who were there at the parliament who witnessed the massacre marched to the American Legion building, which was 2 blocks away. And the site of the massacre was still unfolding, and then bodies were being taken away. Protesters marched to the American Legion, and they started shouting and begging and screaming for support from the Americans. They were basically screaming, help us. We want weapons to fight them with. Did you not just witness this? Like, tell the world what the Soviets do and what they're capable of. And those cries fell on completely deaf ears. Just kidding. There have been larger massacres in Europe after the end of World War II. The largest to date is 7,000 Bosnian Muslims who were massacred in a weekend in July of 1995 during the Bosnian genocide. 20 people to 1,000 is a very big difference. Now, when you're looking at something as large as, like, say, the Holocaust, and people say, well, it was like maybe 5.9 million Jewish people, but up to 6.5 million Jewish people. When you're talking in millions like that, the discrepancy is believable. But 20 is your minimum estimate? Absolutely not. The best estimate, though, is 800 to 1,000 people that were killed on that day in that square. There are a lot of reasons why the exact number isn't possible to settle on, but the most important thing to remember is that the Soviets were in charge of recording everything that happened, and the Soviets always tried to hide things rather than publish the truth about what happened, and the Hungarian government was a puppet of the Soviets.